We'll now hear from Sheikh Abdal Hakim on engaging traditional concepts into the secular university, and inshallah then we will open for questions.
Those who are working in what's called Islamic studies in the context of the modern academy are, I suppose, traditionally invited to become historians. That's the default setting of Oriental studies. You become a historian of languages, texts, literatures, or ideas. This default confidence that the discipline covers only the past with contemporary expressions of Islamic faith and Muslimness being more usually dealt with in faculties of politics, sociology, and the like, serves to perpetuate the historic insistence that in the Western universities, which are heirs to the various compromises which had to happen in the wake of the rather absolutizing Humboldtian revolution 2 centuries ago, religions are not to be taught in structurally or epistemologically equivalent ways. Christianity's present as well as its past is still considered in faculties of theology by practitioners as well as by others, whereas the assumption that what is most important in Islam really comes to its climax with Abbasid Baghdad has automatically imposed a phenomenological method on us at best, if not a simple exercise in historiography and medieval literary criticism. Now, the origins of the bifurcation are very deep and old in our institutions, of course, with the creation in Oxford and Cambridge of chairs of Arabic in the early 17th century. The age of Archbishop Laud was preoccupied with biblical translation, for which the Arabic learning seemed to furnish a useful accompaniment in the understanding of Hebrew lexis and idioms. Enlightenment methods then came along and elevated this philological beginning to undreamed of heights, assuring that while some Oriental studies professors, such as, for instance, Professor Palmer in 19th century Cambridge, maintained a lively interest in contemporary Muslim culture. He regularly wrote rather nice Urdu and Persian contributions to the Indian journals and press, for instance. The substance of their professorial research output was philological. They edited, they translated, and they wrote useful hand lists of Mohammedan manuscripts. The principal non-university environment, which encouraged Oriental learning, the East India Company, trained administrators in Arabic and Persian religious classics, just to enable them to converse impressively with native elites. And in Cambridge, this long-standing legacy was formalised in 1875 with the creation of a syndicate for teaching and examining Indian civil service candidates, with the curriculum again being entirely pre-modern and classical. Some Muslims at that time started to appear in Cambridge, but the tripos menu was certainly not hospitable to the cultivation of insider perspectives. These could only be attempted outside the emergent Oriental studies discipline, in which Orientals themselves seem to be epistemologically disqualified. Take, for instance, the example of one pioneer, Professor Shentok will be familiar with this name, Halil Khalid, born in Ankara in 1869. He spent 5 years at Istanbul's Küçük Ayasofya Madrasa and then progressed to advance fiqh studies elsewhere in the caliphal capital. He also studied at a secular Rushdiya school and took a law degree. Spending time then in the UK, he was appointed an assistant lecturer in Turkish here in Cambridge by E.J.W. Gibb, becoming this city's first significant Muslim intellectual. He soon found, however, that the dominant philological paradigm made it impossible for him to articulate his Cambridge research in ways that were readily and properly intelligible to Muslim thought. Hence his most enduring work from the period is essentially extracurricular and journalistic, warning Muslims against the dangers of collaborating with Western colonial plans for the carve-up of the Muslim world and trying to create methods for protecting Muslim students from cultural alienation as they studied in Western universities. In 1905, this Muslim Turk joined the Cambridge delegation to the World Orientalist Congress held in Algiers. If you think about it, a curious role for this practicing Muslim insider embedded within an Orientalist matrix, speaking to Orientalists in a colonized Muslim city. Such ambiguities and occasionally enjoyable ironies have since that time become, I guess, wryly familiar to Muslims working within traditional Orientalist paradigms. He offers some reflections on this to his fellow Muslims in his published diary of his stay at the conference, From the Memories of Algeria, 1906, and also in a book entitled Oriental Studies in England and on the Continent, in which he further laments that imperial political agendas have taken over British Orientalism much more than they have in, say, universities of France and Germany. Really the first attempt at a Muslim reflection from within the Western Academy on what the Western Academy means for Muslims inhabiting it. He then returned to a theology lecturer's post in Istanbul, where he continued to develop a synthetic theory of Muslim belongingness within contemporary academic paradigms, which would necessarily involve the engagement, he thought, of Islamic thought with modern science in particular. This is evident in his book, Hilal-e Karşı Salib, The Cross Against the Crescent, an exercise in political theology, which he published in 1907. This, again, was certainly not work which could be pursued within the intellectually gated community of Cambridge reason, least of all in the Edwardian imperial age. So philology and historiography have been secular and positivistic crafts, and for quite good reasons, for a long time in our faculties. Even the stirrings of an interest in Islam in the new departments of religious studies across the country, I think are still rather embryonic, have not shifted this assumption that Muslims and something called Islam are the object of study, without insider perspectives being particularly called for in the seminar room. Khalid-based dilemma is still with us. Many still find themselves in this position. A century on, however, the paradigm has become far more contested. Servants of empire are more likely to be trained nowadays in American faculties, and the meaning of the SOAS motto, knowledge is power, has faded, and by many even appropriated for new and unexpected ends, as Muslim and other overseas students learn skills to enhance the economies and intellectual life of ex-colonies. The subaltern foundation for so much of the field, lamented by Khalid, is now in many cases exactly inverted. Take one example, Dr. Buthaina Sha'ban, also associated for a while with SOAS, but who took a PhD from Warwick, a polemical feminist, she's become the main public spokesperson for the Assad regime in Damascus. So Orientalism is certainly not functioning as it once did, although the alienation of which Khalid warned us is a constant. This thing called Islamic studies, which is already an inchoate and contested category, today primarily inhabits two subject areas which are under very considerable cultural and political strain: Oriental studies and religious studies. The future of the former is likely to be secured not by further polemics, either for or against Edward Said, but by the academic eminence and the evident indispensability of research outcomes, and also might, more prosaically, I suspect, by the success of faculty chairs in securing external funding. Religious studies, by contrast, is now experiencing a more recent tremor of post-colonial guilt and identity crisis. Talal Asad, Robert Orsi, and Tomoko Masuzawa have all sought to deconstruct religious studies as an explicitly or implicitly Eurocentric enterprise, replete with false dialectics and illicit reifications. As our field migrated from the unfashionable rubric and agenda of Oriental studies with its perhaps rather dusty philological and historical priorities to board another sinking ship, religious studies, The outcome of this debate is unclear. There are some who seem to advocate a kind of religious ethnic cleansing of the academy, disaggregating and abolishing both departments and distributing any surviving staff over more respectable and wissenschaftliche departments of history, sociology, politics, and linguistics. Others, such as Russell McCutcheon, make a nuanced but forceful case for the validity of the religious studies category, as long as one remembers that all reifications are self-imposed and not inherent. Still others, like in Islamic studies, Aaron Hughes, inveigh mightily against anything that might smack of the failure of reductionism. The departments can be tolerated, he thinks, but insider discourse is normative and hence disallowed, along with any apologetics for a falsely reified Islam, whether or not this happens to be attempted by Muslims. The goddess of reason, set out by Robespierre, is a very jealous goddess. It's here that the cultural wars seem to be most acute and perhaps most reactive to the political pressures on the discipline. One recalls Sarah Strunzer's Jeremiah directed against the German government's decision to establish several new departments of Islamic theology, alleged to be Glaubenslehre of some instrumental and politicized kind. For Strunzer, Muslim believers seem generally incapable of maintaining the critical distance which the Academy, and paradigmatically the Humboldtian German Academy, requires for the unfettered discharge of its calling. For historical reasons, the taxpayer may subsidize Catholic and Lutheran faculties, as is traditional in post-settlement Germany, but Muslims should not be granted the same status until they've thoroughly passed through what the late Pim Fortuyn called the laundromat of modernity. Strunzer seems to be saying that Muslims are not reliably capable of what she calls critical, non-sectarian research. For now, at least, they have to pitch their tents outside the faculty walls. This raises what is possibly the largest and stickiest of questions confronting those who try to welcome the current, as it were, leakage of Oriental studies into other disciplines, the study of Islamism, art history, anthropology, history, and English literature. It's a leaky category. And the debate is not just one that is sharp in Germany. In the United Kingdom, nobody really seems to have decided whether it's actually discriminatory and wrong to assume that theology faculties are by default places where Christians talk about their God to each other. Take, for instance, the late Colin Gunton's volume, The Cambridge Companion to Christian Doctrine, published by the Cambridge University Press. No one seems particularly concerned by the fact that all of its contributors are writing from a rather exuberant faith position. The faculties often still reflect this. Oxford, only one salient case. However, the Britain from which these divinity schools were designed and in which the old interfaculty and interdisciplinary boundaries made sense has changed fundamentally. By the year 2030, there will be more practicing Muslims than practicing Christians in the UK. By 2050, practicing Hindus will have overtaken their Christian counterparts. Only 3% of Britons under the age of 26 now self-identify as Anglican. And yet, Anglican theology remains the default and the preponderant subject matter in most theology faculties. In modern British cities, where engagé Muslims already typically outnumber their Christian counterparts, particularly amongst the young people who are apt to apply for universities, the Anglican near monopoly is clearly a survival from a much older culture. But should the response be to abolish theology as an academic discipline, and thereby to dodge the whole question of definitions and inclusivity? If nobody at all is allowed to practice a kind of insider Glaubenslehre in a modern university, then Strunzer's polemic becomes odious. And Hughes's fierce insistence that Muslim perspectives must be excluded from academic Islamic studies will become more coherent and less implicitly discriminatory. Against this project of diminishing, rather than accommodating a diversity, even a clashing diversity of scholarly epistemes, let's consider, firstly, Strunzer's apparent assumption that committed Muslims cannot be trusted to entertain critical discourses. This is in turn predicated on the assumption that traditional departments of Oriental studies are all populated by value-neutral and unproblematically objective heroes of Wissenschaft. But a survey of the academic record in our field may induce skepticism on these grounds. Not to be Muslim is not necessarily to be an adherent of a putative Enlightenment view from nowhere, of the type that Aaron Hughes thinks should be obligatory. In practice, our field has always been full of advocacy of various kinds: pro-Palestinian, pro-Islamic, pro-deconstruction, pro-socialist, pro-Armenian, pro-Catholic, and yet this has constituted part of its polemical, argumentative dynamism, where the field's richness and energy and interest have been without, say, the preconciliar Catholic piety of Georges Anouati and Louis Massignon, or the Marxian stubbornness of Maxime Rodinson and Aziz al-Azmi, or the Christian campaigning zeal of Christoph Luxemburg and Gabriel Said Reynolds. The Ottoman studies of Colin Imber are excellent, and not diminished by his atheistic commentary and judgment on his Muslim jurists. We've long ago let go of the Husserlian dream of bracketing out our own worldview in favour of a more realistic and also, I think, humanly enriching acknowledgement of our situatedness. Asser, McCutcheon and others have remarked in detail on this. Instead of claiming the superhuman status of objective and critical exegetes suspended by Richard Rorty's skyhooks high above the messy data and its own traditional advocates and guardians, we now acknowledge our own situatedness, while recognising also that in many subdivisions of our craft that this cannot be particularly salient. One can write on, say, Mamluk coinage, or Ottoman defter registers, or Abbasid belles-lettres, or Razi's view on angels, without it really mattering where one stands on the truth of the Quranic revelation, or the truth of the Roman Catholic Church, or of atheism. Most of the field doesn't actually matter anyway. Already we note that the idol of positivist fideism advocated by the likes of Hughes has fallen in Buddhist studies. This is evident to anybody who strays into one of their conferences. Take as an indicative example a recent Festschrift by Damien Kuhn, Buddhist Studies from India to America, Essays in Honour of Charles S. Prebish, published in the series Routledge Critical Studies in Buddhism. The reviewer, Denise Krush from Bath, makes this observation. It is interesting how many scholars within Buddhist studies, including Charles Prebish himself, are also practitioners of Buddhist paths, which makes difficult any division into academic and insider perspectives. It's instructive, I think, to compare an Islamic studies journal with its Buddhist equivalent, to note a radical divergence in paradigms, with the former publications often laboriously defending an old insider-outsider dichotomy which serious Buddhist studies left behind several decades ago. Buddhism is by no means the only example which springs to mind. George Marston, in a famous postscript to his 1994 book, The Soul of the American University, by querying the positivist prejudices of the secular academy, observed that many determinative aspects of an academic's identity, including gender, sexuality, and race, are considered to be legitimate and welcome personal perspectives from which to pursue scholarship. Theological identity, however, is supposed to be excluded, even though it has much to contribute to important modern arguments about scientific reductionism, for instance, or moral relativism and nihilism. The monotheist cannot simply hang up his worldview with his raincoat and hat when entering the faculty building, while others take their Buddhist, gay, or feminist identities with them. The conclusion's pretty evident and quite Saidian, I suppose. Some worldviews are fashionable in the ambient culture and are hence acceptable within the faculties, while others are not. Reason probably plays only a slight role in this discernment. This comment on epistemic odd-handedness in the academy does not, however, quite crack the problem of the validity of an Islamic theology, conceived as an avowedly insider project in a university setting. To deal with this, it would be useful first to recognise that Salafist fideism apart, Islam's truth claims are in fact thought to stand or fall on judgments which can in principle be recognised or ratified in a secular space. For Ash'arism, and so I think particularly the Maturidi tradition, inherited by quite a lot of subcontinental British undergraduates, unexamined faith is either invalid or sinful. Bejuri says, فَكُلُّ مَنْ قَلَّدَ بِالتَّوْحِيدِ إِيمَانُهُ لَمْ يَخْلُ مِنْ تَرْدِيدِ. Whoever just copies religion and his belief, his faith will not be devoid of hesitations. It's interesting to recall, I think, that the very first stirrings of the modern German university took place at the hands of the commission appointed by the Duke of Weimar in 1784, chaired by no less a personality than Goethe. The ensuing new curriculum at Jena, which anticipated the Humboldtian revolution and therefore spread ultimately to places like Cambridge, emphasized the autonomy of truth free from any guild of theologians or other obscurantists. Yet it was the same Goethe who wrote these words about Islam. Some of you might have seen Eric Ormsby's new translation of Goethe's Westostlicher Divan. But he writes this in one of his letters. Something of that faith is held in us all. The Mohammedans begin their instruction in philosophy with the doctrine that nothing exists of which the contrary may not be affirmed. Thus they practice the minds of youth by giving them the task of detecting and expressing the opposite of every proposition, from which great adroitness in thinking and speaking is sure to arise. Suddenly, after the contrary of any proposition has been maintained, doubt arises as to which is really true. But there is no permanence in doubt. It incites the mind to closer inquiry and experiment, from which, if rightly managed, certainty proceeds, and this alone, and in this alone, can man find thorough satisfaction. You see that nothing is wanting in this doctrine, that with all our systems we've got no further, and that, generally speaking, no one can get further. Somehow, Goethe had heard rumours of the rationalising Hanafi usul of the great Ottoman academies. In this genesis moment of the modern university, it's legitimate, I think, to propose a convergence, at least a potential one, between Glaubenslehre of a rigorous dialectical Kalam type with the emergent ideology of a privileged public reason. It's not a zero-sum game. German professors are Kant's children, taking their cue from Kant's Streit der Fakultäten, in which he maps the due grounds of any valid discourse in philosophy and the other humanities. British universities have largely followed the same programme. Kant's concern is to detach reason and its academic pursuit from ecclesial entanglement. One must not subscribe academically to any position which is heteronomously supplied in advance by denomination, heritage, or magisterium. Thinkers can and must reach what conclusions they will, including religious and confessional conclusions, but only on the basis of public reason pursued in collaboration with similarly unfettered colleagues. Wissenschaft is a community's project of public reason, construed as something which in principle could embrace all of society. Now, as Professor Schinter indicated, with the postmodern withering of the brave Kantian assurance about autonomous reason and the possibility of truth being discerned through the collegiate weaving together of the discourses of a community of free minds, we find, for instance, the protest of the Cambridge theologian Mike Higton in his book A Theology of Higher Education. For Higton, the university that they envisage does not actually allow each citizen to speak on his own behalf if he is not allowed to speak as the member of the particular positive religious and secular traditions that have shaped him. The very stricture that the Romantist theorists erect in order to preserve free sociality is one that makes it impossible. Having pointed to this highly restrictive axiom of the Kantian model, Higton then laments what he sees as the near collapse of the Enlightenment vision of a university as a coherent community of seekers after public truth. The pursuit of truth has recently been set at the margins, either due to the ongoing monetizing of the academy, or because of hyper-specialization and weak interdisciplinarity, or because of a general postmodern culture in which the pursuit of truth is dismissed, in any case, as a fool's errand. To underline the obsolescent status of the older Orientalism, we note that much recent philosophy provides an accessory to the progressive interrogation, or again abolition, of the discipline of Islamic studies as an objective exercise in historiography by the detached Western self. For instance, Deleuzians and their allies influentially challenged the Enlightenment assurance about any truth as bearing fixity and relationship to public reason. For this, Deleuze would have us think, is nothing but a region carved out of the irrational. Even in the natural sciences, facts are thought to be significantly attributable to those who advocate them. the truths to which Islamic or any other studies incline, however forensically supported by apparatus and annotations of the various kinds required in the guild, are only cultural facts. And this perhaps accounts for the flux of thesis and antithesis in intellectual fashions and ideas, for instance about the origins of Islam. Our findings inhabit a metaphysical bubble floating in the spume of principial chaos, where medieval and also Enlightenment universities of the Humboldtian type assumed an orderly physical creation which philosophy ought to mirror and match. The quantum revolution seems increasingly to be the ontological ground of the modern humanities, where movements are never decisive and everything oscillates. The wider Western culture, which is the Academy's life support system, seems to underpin this. Occidentals no longer generally look to humanities departments for guidance towards truth. They resemble something more like ornaments, which accompany what is de facto the real business of a research university, which is enhancing physical knowledge and wealth creation, with the business school increasingly accorded special status and privileges. In this way, any relic of a non-mercantile unifying principle is lost. As Benedict Ashley comments, the very term university means many looking towards one, and is related to the term universe, the whole of reality. Thus, the name no longer seems appropriate to such a fragmented modern institution whose unity is provided only by a financial administration and perhaps a sports team. This is the hotel corridor model of how university is structured. The fact that we're startled or inclined to cynicism when told that the modern university began as a project for the seeking of public truth reminds us how very far we've travelled from that ideal. In the context of Islamic studies, however, it should be evident that the remnants of the Wissenschaftsideology, which demands that I participate only as myself, and not as, for instance, as a Marxist or a Christian or an Ash'ari, are really no longer sufficient to suffocate the plurality of a modern Islamic studies program or to limit its horizons. Whether we like it or not, heteronomy is here to stay.